Hi, I'm making this video to help teachers learn how to take a basic science lecture and turn it into an active learning session in the flipped classroom approach. Okay, so you might wonder a little bit about what literature exists on a flipped classroom, and there are a lot of different articles out there that are discipline specific. So according to the discipline that you teach the most, I teach medicine and I teach the anatomical sciences, you might want to look up the articles from journals that are in your discipline to see what other people have done. But if you just want to look at a overall good article, the one here I have highlighted in red does give you a lot of background information and talk about teaching in the health professions and how flipped classroom might be of benefit. But just to start off, what is a flipped classroom, or at least what is it when I'm talking about it? It's also referred to as a reverse classroom or inverse or backwards. It's a learning session where the main material that you want the students to learn that you previously given by a lecture, so all the didactic information, you give it to the student to complete that part of it before the in-class session. And so that frees you up to use the in-class session for active learning activities and let the students work together or work with you and be involved in the material that you're trying to teach them. And another aside is that it also allows you to give students formative feedback on how well they learn the material, and just instead of just using the passive session to disseminate the material to them. And so I kind of came up with 3 different steps that I use when I'm flipping my classroom. I spend a lot of time going on over the preparatory materials for the students, and my other faculty members can use those materials too. So it's not just for the students if you teach in a team-taught situation. And then I spend all the time the next materials I make are the live session materials, put that together and make sure I know what I'm going to do with my class time. And then I always have an after session where I take notes, I sit down with my notes, and then I make improvements for the next time. I gave my first flipped classroom session, which I traditionally had done as a lecture in a medical histology class of March last year. The class attendance for my in-class activities or in-class lecture was down to 15 to 20 people out of 200, and I really was finding that kind of teaching dissatisfying. And so I wanted to use that class time, instead of talking to those 20 students about the material passively, I wanted to use it as a way to be more involved with the students and see if I can take that time and make it more impactful. And when I asked them, the students had never come to this type of session before at this institution. Only half of them reported that they looked over any preparation materials. Now, I just did one a couple days ago, and the students are a lot more familiar with my style of teaching in the flipped classroom, and only 8% of those students reported not preparing. So it was quite a difference just with a little bit of experience. So this is what one of my lectures looked like previously when I sat down with my lecture and I went through the flipped classroom maneuver. And so I had a lot of pictures in there, and I also had a lot of background information, or the words and information that I wanted them to learn in a lecture. But it's possible that your lecture looks like this, where you just have a picture up there and then you talk about what you want them to know about that picture, or about that structure or process, whatever you're showing. And if that's the case, then the group of pictures that you have in a PowerPoint really isn't your lecture. It's just pictures. You have to then also write down everything that you say about those structures or that information, because that is really more of a complete view of what your presentation was that you're trying to turn into a flipped session. So what I like to do is make an outline of all the topics that I talk about in a lecture that I want the students to know. And this really, luckily for me, follows along with a simple textbook that I have for the students, so the students can read the textbook, or they can, I give them this kind of outline so they can look over the information in an outline form. I always have a proportion of students who like that approach. And then I record a lecture for them using my kind of skinny down version PowerPoint for the students who want to watch it as a movie. And let's see, Then I'll also give them a copy of the PowerPoint if they want to flip through the PowerPoint and they don't want to watch the movie. So I give them 4 different ways that they can look over the material I want them to look over before they come into the in-class session. So the important thing with any learning session is that you know what the goal of your session is, and you know the objectives of the session. So you know all of the information or what you want them to do in the end, what information you want them to recall, describe, or explain. And you need to make your preparatory materials match that expectation. Because if you don't actually give them the materials for them to learn, whether it is a required textbook chapter or it's your own lecture or self-made PowerPoint, then the students will be very frustrated because they don't know what they need to do to show up to class and be prepared. And so generally, I like to point out how the reference materials should be time consuming for you to make, but once you make them, then they should be done well, and you shouldn't have to keep making them from scratch every year. But whatever you choose, make sure it is a good reference, that it's complete and has the information in it that you need your students to look at and reach the objectives. If it's too light or the material is too dense, the students will come to you and they will be very frustrated before you even get into your in-class session. And I want to point out, because some faculty feel, or you might sort of think that you can make up for the materials and do all the learning in your class session, but that's not going to be the place that you're going to get an opportunity to disseminate learning. It is going to be the place where you deepen learning. So make sure that you spend time putting that learning information in the materials. And the students tend to think that you are being lazy when you don't spend time making good reference materials. So make sure that this step is given a lot of consideration, as much consideration as the active learning activities that you do in class. So after you know the topics that you're going to teach, what you really need to do is make a template. So you can take your ideas for activities and you can just drop them in every time that you want to make a flipped class session, instead of starting over every time. So this is what my template looks like. It's in a PowerPoint format that I don't share with my students, so they don't know all the answers ahead of time. And I put the activity name that I've decided to do that day at the top, and then I have links to different places in my PowerPoint that is going to bring me to a question or a case or an activity. And then I can go along and I can click the link like I'm going to do here, and it would take me to a question. The students have the availability to answer these questions with the technology we have at the institution. And after they do the question and they answer, then I go back to my home page and I go to the next activity first question. So this works really well for me because I know what the different categories are and I know what the activities are, so if time allows me to skip ahead or slow down if I need to do that. Okay, so I spent a lot of time thinking about activities. And so I want to share some with you just to give you maybe some ideas, because thinking of science activities that students can work together with that is quick enough that you can do a whole bunch of them and cover a lot of topics, but deep enough that they learn something from it is kind of difficult. So I kind of put together some activity ideas, 2 which you probably do not consider new, and then 10 that you might. So what I call an old friend is just a clicker question like you saw previously. So it's a question that is just a multiple choice question that you would make up, and I'm sure you do make those up regularly, even if you put them in your lectures and you don't even ask the students to respond to them, you just ask them to think about it. But these questions are really comfortable for students. They like them because they feel like they're learning what they need to learn for the test style question. They're easy for probably you to write because you're used to writing a multiple choice question, and you can have a whole lot of backup questions to cover in time or to cover a lot of topics in a short amount of time if that's what you need to do. And then another thing I like about it now, if you have the software to be able to get them to interact with you and get feedback on how well they're answering the questions, they get formative feedback and you get feedback about how well they understand the material. And there are some platforms that are free that you could look up if you want to start to get that feedback and your institution doesn't offer that technology. Okay, so this is just an example of a question that I would ask, well, which of the following structures are not normally found, and then they have to think about what they are and what the definitions of these structures are, and then they answer, and then I can talk about what the answer is and give a little very, very short reminder of the information that they would need to review to make sure that they know this as they keep going. And another old friend, or something you're probably very familiar with, is a patient or clinical case. And I went to a conference, and several second-year medical students were talking about the different teaching styles that they liked the most, and all of them said that they liked to hear about clinical cases and personal stories. One student reported that she enjoyed that because hearing personal stories increased her retention of the basic science information. It gave her a face to go with the disease name or processes that they were talking about. Another student said that it was great to have their teacher actually point out how empathy for patients is an important part of the learning process. So that was a good point that I wanted to share with you. And then another student mentioned that having these clinical cases makes the material more meaningful for them. And so this is how I would do a clinical case. This is actually a real YouTube video that is up that I just link into my PowerPoint, because YouTube videos are real people and they are voluntarily sharing their stories, and so I like to make sure that I add them into my presentations, because students have access to these stories, and it's not something that I had to get permission for, because it's already up on the internet. I always give myself a reminder of where to go to in the video somewhere, or how long to play it for. And I really like personal stories instead of sort of formal or professional made videos, because people will talk about how they felt or feel during their diagnosis process. They also give opinions or talk about how practitioners have treated them, and I think that that gives you other things that you can talk about with your students and other things that they're learning by watching that video besides just the disease. And they also talk about how the disease or the condition that they're experiencing is impacting them and how they feel about their outlook, and those are also other good important things that students should learn about, even if I'm not teaching a class on those topics. And then lastly, I like talking or seeing real people talk about their conditions, because they point out things that might not be necessarily medically accurate or scientifically true. And it's good for medical students to see that it's possible the communication and conveying the reality of what a situation is truthfully, openly, honestly, and at a real basic level to patients is really meaningful, because they're going to be talking about their conditions and what they understand about it, and you want to make sure that your patients understand what's happening so that they have the complete picture and they're talking to other people about it and spreading awareness. And so after I would give a video, a very short video, I would usually give a question to follow up with that. Just a short question that integrate that person's case back down to the material that I'm trying to teach the students. And then if it's a hard question, like this last one here, this was sort of the distribution of the answers from my students, then I might even have a little follow-up slide where I have inserted some pictures and maybe a little blurb, and then just point out the part of the material that they needed to review again if they didn't get that right. Okay, and now I have some creative ideas for you to help spread active learning and make it easier for you to do these types of sessions with your students, because one of the hardest things is actually trying to think of what to do. And so activity number 1, I call histology heads up. You could put other pictures in here. I don't know what you teach, but there's always a visual representation that you can make to represent your discipline. So I would have a histology slide here, and only one person can look at the screen, and the other person that they're partnered with has to either cover their eyes or look away. And the person looking at the screen firstly has to know what they're looking at. So if they don't know and they didn't prepare, they might have to look it up or ask ask another person, because it's not going to be possible for them to participate if they don't know what the answer is. But their partner is going to ask questions and try to get to, in this case, the epithelial type that is shown. And so they can go back and forth. The next time you come up on that activity, they switch and the other person looks at the screen. And so this is sort of a fun thing that you can do with any visual representation of science. At the end, they click in to get their points. They're usually competing in my class, and if they got it, they get to click A and get their points, and if they didn't, then they get click B. So, okay, activity number 2, I call the selfie game. It's after an app that my kids play and talk to me about, where you have a picture that usually has a person or something in it, and then you guess the most appropriate caption. And so that's sort of what I've done here. This is an anatomic representation, or it's a figure artistic representation of the middle ear, and I've highlighted 3 structures here, and this was something that I had already had in my PowerPoint guide that I gave them and also in my lecture. And so then they have to pick a caption image that they think best matches this, and these captions all have anatomic structures in it, so that I'm trying to see whether or not they remember what those structures are. And they can work together as a group because they're getting points, they're competing as a group on this one, and they can help each other learn where the different structures are located at. Okay. The next one is called Pictionary, and this is, as you would imagine, it's very much like playing Pictionary. What I would do is I draw a crude representation of something. For this case, this is the only thing I gave them, that this area was the pons. So this is the brainstem here, coming up in to the cerebrum. This is supposed to represent the diencephalon, and it's sort of just a figure here, and hopefully diagrammatically they can figure out which tract I'm trying to point out. And I also have this set at speed scoring, so the first people to put in the answers, the correct answer, the fastest, actually gets points on this. And you can set it up to where if other people get the right answer but they're not the fastest, they can get partial credit. So that is how that works. The next one I call Teach the Teacher, and I actually used this one this week, and it went over pretty well. And this one is where you would give them instructions at their table. You could either have them partner up or you can have them work. We have tables of 7. And they would prepare a 60-second or less teach on a topic. And for this this example, I gave rotation of the gut. And this past week I did histology, and I would have them, the respiratory system, and I had them do a short teach on how the histology of the larynx is different from other parts of the respiratory system. That's an example. And then they would talk about it, and the first group to mic in and say that they want to present gets the opportunity to present, and I have the points set up so that if they were the ones to present and they got it all right, then they got a point, and you can get partial credit if you were the winning group and you were brave enough to present but you didn't get everything right, or you got partial credit if you weren't the winning group to present but you got all the points right. You got partial credit for that too. So that actually works pretty well. It does take a little longer than the other activities. New activity number 5, called Text or Call a Friend, and you would use this when you want to show how the material that you're teaching is relevant to the outside world. And so, for example, I asked the students to call or text somebody, it could be anybody outside of the class, and ask them what part of the body they thought the ear cavity or the middle ear connected to. And so then I had all these examples of answers here, and I actually got, lots of people, family members said different things. And then in the end, I gave them, I didn't put it on this slide, but I gave them the right answer, and then I had them, they could raise their hand and say other things if they weren't listed. And the students thought, it's sort of a silly, fun thing to break up your material, but it does show outside relevance to what they're learning. The next one, Tell Me a Story, is where I would start off some sort of physiologic response or some sort of procedure or process that has several steps. And so you let them, you could do this individual or you could do it in pairs, and you would start them off with a story. Once upon a time there was a significant drop in renal blood flow causing the juxtaglomerular cells to secrete renin. And then you have them finish the story, and they only have 1 minute and 30 seconds to think of how they would finish the story. And what you could do is before you have them present, and then you give them sort of the answer if you decided not to do the presentations, or if they did an individual story and they want to see whether they got the points. You would go through it very, very briefly, not as a lecture, but just brief points to make sure they got everything right, and then they can claim, if they got all the points, they can claim their points by clicking A, and if not, B. Okay, and this is a very sort of silly one. I have teenagers, as if you can't tell, and my one of my teens plays this game, Katamari Damacy, which you could give your students a password or a document that you would only let them open when it was time to play this activity. So I already made this ahead of time. I give it to them right now, and they open the PowerPoint slide. On the PowerPoint slide, they have to select all the cells that belong to the myeloid cell sim line, and they only have 30 seconds. So it's sort of like playing a video game, or playing a game where they're using the material, and they have to see what they know and what they've left out. And so in this, I have music turned off. They would come and they would click on these different cells, and there's a little bit of activity, completely hokey. I made this myself, and it would add their selections to this panel. And I made this in PowerPoint using the animations. It wasn't really too hard to do. And the idea is, once you make a template like this, you can put different words in the boxes. All of the links are already made for you, and you can put a different question at the top, and you can change the game, but keep your template, and it makes it go faster. And then after you play the game, they only have 30 seconds. Like, say time's up, you tell them the right answer, and then if they got it, they claim their points by clicking A, and if not, then they click B. New activity number 8 is just, I call Clue, and this one I made up thinking about how you would do a involved patient case that was not just by talking to students, because I think that's a lot of representing patient cases turns into a mini lecture, and students sort of unplug when you start to do that. And so I came up with this idea is to say you have your students in an active session, and they all are at different groups or tables. So you would have to set up the envelopes on the table to have clues inside, and then you would regulate how often the group gets to send a member to another table to get a clue, and they would be keeping track of the clues that they received at the tables. And so for this game, it's what condition is the patient suffering from, and all the tables have different clues. Now, one of the things that's fun about this is that the tables get to select the person, and maybe you could make it even a different person every time, but they get to select the person that goes around the room and sees the clues. So if it's a clue that they have to interpret visually, then that person has to be able to identify a cell or a disease or something by a visual clue. You could also have lab values, and you could have in the end they could get their points that way. But this was just some examples. Like, you could have blood smears if the students were needing to identify different cells. You could have a different patient symptom at the different tables, or you could have a different lab value. You could even mix all of these things up. But the idea is that you're playing the clue game, they're learning patient symptoms or cases, and they're doing it actively instead of being talked to. The new idea activity for number 9 I call Missing Piece, and this is a very quick basic sort of science situation where you would take a process or some sort of reaction, and then you would take a chunk out of it, and then you would fill it in with multiple options in here, so that they have to pick which one is right to go into this figure that is showing oxidative phosphorylation. And I have speed scoring set up, so they have to do it, and they have to do it quickly if they want to get their points. So they love competitions. It really gives them a little extra incentive. And so I like this one, and it could be used in so many different ways. And the last activity I have to share, idea that I made up, is musical chairs. And so for this one, if you have a bunch of groups and people in different groups, you could play some music, and during the music you would ask them to write a question as a group about a treatment, in this case of hyperlipidemia. You could make it about anything that's part of your information that you're teaching. And then when the music stops, you would send the member of your group to the other group that you designate. In this case, I have them moving up because we have numbered groups, and then we have A's and B's in each number. And then they would ask that group the question that they made up themselves, and then if they get it right, they get to check A, and if they get it wrong, they have to check B. And so that's just sort of another fun way of having them think about what they should ask, and then posing the question, and they're also being asked a question at the same time. So it could be used in lots of different ways. Okay, so back to your learning session. You have all of the topics that you are going to cover in your learning session. What I would do is I have made an outline, and then on my computer I highlight which ones I use for which activity, so that I know what I've done last year if I want to make up a new one, or if I just want to make sure that I have good representation of different topics. I've also made all of my topics on note cards, which I can assemble into different categories. That works too. I kind of like, I started off with note cards, and then I moved to an outline that I could save on my computer so I could reference it later. So whatever works, whatever your style, or you might come up with a new way. And then what I do is I put the titles of the activities I selected to do that day on the top, and then I would fill in my template that I had already made with the new questions for that day, and then save it. And it saves you a lot of time of having to start from scratch each time. And then when I gave this seminar at my institution, I asked everyone to talk about what activities that they liked, and there was a wide variety. When I asked the students which activities that they like, they always choose that they like the clinical cases and the clicker questions the most. And they do like the other ones. I always get some representation that's there, but for the wide majority of students that self-report to me, they really like clicker style questions and the clinical cases, and therefore I always use those two activities in every flipped classroom session that I do. Okay, so I have a few rules here that I always follow to have a successful lesson. The first one is I try to find out who it is that I'm teaching. I always at the beginning of the lesson ask them what they did to prepare, to see how many people did nothing. I want to know how many people in the audience came completely unprepared for the lesson. And like I said, the first time I did it, it was half of them had not done anything, but this last time that they getting used to me, and I only had 8% of these medical students that did nothing before they walked in. Most of the time, they look through my PowerPoint and they like to watch my recorded lecture. But I still have a small proportion of students who like to read the textbook and look over my outline study guide, and that's why I go through the motions of making those as well. Next one, spread out your activities evenly amongst your topics. We all have things that we like to teach, and we have things that we don't like to teach, but the idea here is that you're showing them a representation of all the information that they need to know. If you already target all of your activities and questions down to the things you know you want to ask on a test, then you're really shooting yourself in the foot in some ways, because the students will catch on that, and they will really just target that information, and they'll see that other information as completely useless. Whereas you don't really know what's going to be asked on board exams, and you don't know how the material is integrated necessarily in everything that they do later in their career. And so you should really represent your whole discipline. I really firmly believe in retrieval, and I found this online, this site, lots of collaborators who also have the same belief system I do, and that's retrieving information is what deepens learning. Being talked to multiple times or rereading notes, those activities are not going to deepen learning or increase retention of knowledge, but retrieval does, and that's why I'm trying to flip all of my sessions that were previously completely passive sessions into sessions that involve retrieving the information, and I hope that this helps you get on that path as well. I think that another important thing that I've seen other people do differently, and I've noticed that it has different reactions, is I try to make all of my activities or questions give the students feedback. At the end, they find out whether they're right or wrong, and that helps them know if they're learning the information correctly. And I think that that's also helpful for you as a teacher to be able to identify individuals who are stuck, and they're stuck on material that is usually material that's more difficult. And if they're not getting feedback, they can't come to you and ask for help and know that they need to ask for help. I always put in clinical questions and clinical cases so that I can show the students where they're going to use this information in their careers, and I think that that helps get them more excited about basic science information. A lot of times I will hear students talk about, and I've also read in the literature, people discuss how basic science disciplines can feel completely unrelated to clinical practice later on. And so I think that showing students repetitively how this information is going to help them later will get them more excited about the discipline that you're talking about and make them feel like it's more relevant to them. And this is as important as everything else in this session, that please resist the urge to talk to your students during this session that you made for them. You made them a session so that they can have an active learning session. And what I've heard from students talk about sessions that don't go so well, they talk about how the person they have a question, or they present a case and they want them to discuss it, and then they stand up and they spend 15 minutes just talking to them about it as if it was a lecture. And so if I ever touch the mic or I turn on the mic to explain something, I try to limit it to 30 seconds or less. Otherwise, I'm not going to get through all of my active sessions, and it turns it into a passive session. And I can't emphasize enough how important it is to make good prep materials for your students and for your faculty. They really need those to have direction on what they need to learn. And in one of the articles I was reading that I cited at the beginning of this paper, that it takes about 127% more time to prepare the flipped classroom materials. And I think that you should be aware that that's going to happen, but you should also think about this increased satisfaction that you're going to have after you finish your learning session. And I have found it to be much more satisfying, and I hope that you give it a try and you find it to be that as well. And then I like to over-prepare my activities. I like to make sure I have some extras, and so that I can cover as much information that I can. You might think that something is hard, and the students might not find it difficult, and therefore you can go through it faster and you can cover more material. And that's why I have this kind of template, because I know that these questions are really fast. These activities are going to be much longer, and then these are going to be somewhere in the middle. And so I can use my time wisely and hurry through the ones that are quick and that they get fast and they know really well, and that gives me more time to cover more difficult material or give them a little extra time to talk about a patient's case. And then don't forget that you need to refresh your knowledge. Even if you have all of your materials made from last year, you need to have that knowledge when you stand in the classroom of all the material that you ask them to be prepared for, because they're going to ask you those hard integrative questions. And even though your materials are made, or maybe you've already recorded your lecture, you need to spend that time to get yourself to that point too. And you need to make the corrections that happened from making your session. There's always going to be a broken link, or there's going to be a box that didn't come up correctly. And there are also changes in your materials from a new edition of a textbook. And I know that causes a struggle in most institutions, because educators are oftentimes given credit for the contact hours that they had, not prep hours. And maybe you can talk to your institution about setting up a different kind of recording system and reporting, where you talk about the amount of time it takes you to prepare these types of sessions. And then the really hard thing to do is to be open to criticism from your students and fellow faculty members about parts of your activities that you made that maybe didn't go over so well. It's really hard when you make something new and you think it's fun and you're trying to be innovative, and then someone tells you that they didn't like it. But you have to be open, because in the end you're making these activities for your students so that they can learn better and they can learn deeper and hold on to the information longer. And so you need to listen to your data about your activities and not your personal feelings about what you think lesson or learning should be like. You might think that your students need to write down everything or take notes, or you might think that you need to explain a case more in depth and give them the background information. But if 99% or 100% of your students got the questions right, you don't need to pick up the microphone and talk about it. And so those are just some concerns that you need to think about. So in summary, I hope you want to try Flipped Classroom, even if you teach in the basic sciences, because I think that it's still a lot of fun, and I think that you might find it more satisfying for you, and your students might like it as well. Please start with good learning objectives and write out all your topics and make sure that it covers all the information that you would have covered in a passive learning session. Make sure that you spend a lot of time on the materials so that they're quality. You can reuse these materials, probably with minimal revision each year. And pick the activities that fit your topic material. Maybe you talk more about processes and you have less visual identification, like I do in histology, and so you might want to use some of these other ideas, and that might fit for you. And then if I always follow those rules that I already discussed to make sure that it's successful. And maybe you think of other ideas. If you do, please let me know. I'd love to add them to my discussion. I have a template for an active session if you would like to download it and use it to get yourself started on Flipped Classroom. I have a little PowerPoint where it just gives you all of those activity ideas if you would like that too. And this is my email. I have Facebook and Instagram. Thanks for listening. I hope you found part of this interesting, and have a good day.